The old service tunnel breathed in shallow, uneven drafts, almost as though the mountain itself were struggling to remember how to inhale. Darkness clung to the concrete in damp, ribbon-like strands, reluctant to peel back even when my flashlight swept across it. For a moment, as the beam jittered from my trembling hand, I could swear the shadows recoiled, not from the light, but from me. The first 100 words of any tale are supposed to reveal a path. Instead, mine offered only fragments of silence, the kind that presses too close to the ribs and waits for something inside you to crack. This place, this forgotten artery beneath the northern ridge, had been sealed since 2002, boarded and bolted after the collapse of the research station above it. But storms last week had torn away the barricades, coughing up dust and long-buried memories the way the uprooted earth reveals bones when it loses patience with the living. I hadn't meant to come inside. I had only meant to look, to see if the rumors about exposed tunnels were true. Yet here I was, boots crunching on debris that smelled faintly of mildew and old regret, walking deeper as if the darkness had looped a finger beneath my collar and tugged. A faint drip echoed from somewhere deeper, a slow, persistent tap against stone. It carried a strange rhythm, like a breath caught between sobs, and it set my nerves humming with a familiar dread. It reminded me of the attic in my childhood home during midsummer storms, where rain wormed its way through the cracked shingles and fell onto cardboard boxes full of things nobody wanted to remember. The tapping had lulled me to sleep back then, though it never comforted me. It sounded too much like someone packing overhead in slow, tired circles. Tonight it sounded like a warning. I told myself I was only documenting the sight, that this was just a detour on my drive home, but even I didn't believe the lie. The truth, the one whispered only in the marrow, was that I had come because something in this place felt familiar, as though I'd stepped into an echo of a moment I had never lived, but had somehow carried with me like a dormant bruise. The tunnel widened ahead, revealing abandoned equipment draped in sheets of dust. A collapsed ladder lay twisted like a broken limb beside a rusted cart. My flashlight traced the edges of peeling paint, flacking like old scabs across the wall. Each flake reflected light differently, creating an impression of movement, as if the room shifted with my breathing. But the silence held everything together. A thick, slow silence, the kind that gathers after a scream ends. I felt watched, though I knew there was nothing here, nothing living anyway. The deeper I pushed, the more the air tightened around me, wrapping itself in subtle tension. I could almost sense a pulse beneath the floor, faint, rhythmic, like a heartbeat buried under decades of dust. For someone else, this might have been an abandoned tunnel. For me, it felt like a memory I had tried too hard to forget. A place where grief settled like cold fog, creeping underneath the skin until it reached the bones. The light trembled again. I swallowed hard and reminded myself, this is just the beginning. But beginnings are dangerous things. They disguise themselves as curiosity before revealing their teeth. And somewhere ahead, in the silent dark, something waited. Something that had been missing for 20 years. Something that carried the shape of a girl whose name I had tried not to speak. The mountain exhaled again, low and hollow, like a sigh of recognition. And I stepped further in. Her name was Crane, 17 when she vanished in the autumn of 2002, swallowed by the cold Colorado dusk as though the air itself had closed around her. She had been one of those girls who seemed to glow from the inside, not brightly but steadily, a soft pulse of warmth in a town too used to winter. Her disappearance had cracked something in the community. It had split the season in two. Before, after. I had barely been old enough then to understand the weight of grief, but even as a child, I remembered the way adults whispered her name with careful precision, as though it were a fragile glass ornament that might shatter if spoken too loudly. That memory pressed heavily on my mind as the tunnel opened into a chamber, and my flashlight caught on something small lodged in a drift of rubble. At first, I thought it was a piece of scrap metal or a trinket from the old station. But when I knelt to brush away the dust, its shape emerged with unsettling clarity. A silver necklace, tarnished, cold, and unmistakably familiar. A tiny charm shaped like a crescent moon. This moon! I froze, breath stuttering in my chest. I had seen this charm once before, years ago, dangling from her collarbone in a school photo pinned to the community board. Her mother had said it was the last gift she ever gave her daughter. The crescent, she'd said, was for protection, for light in dark places. But here it was, half buried under rubble that should never have been disturbed. My first thought was how. It was why now. As though the mountain had waited for the exact moment, I stepped inside before loosening its grip. As though it had been holding its breath for 20 years, guarding this small, glinting fragment of a lost girl until I was the one who returned to find it. I lifted the necklace, and the chain slid against my glove with a delicate whisper, the sound of something resurfacing, of something no longer willing to stay hidden. Around me the chamber seemed to darken, shadows thickening like ink. My mind began to cloud with memories I wasn't sure belonged to me, echoes of voices, footsteps on leaves, a warm laugh, a flash of silver at a girl's throat. The air pressed against my ears, distorting the silence until it sounded nearly like a faint cry. And for a moment, a fleeting, breath-tightening moment, I felt the presence of someone standing behind me, close enough that the hairs on my neck prickled. But when I turned, there was only darkness. The necklace clicked softly as I closed my fist around it. That tiny sound reverberated through the chamber like a dropped pin in a cathedral. A symbolic object, maybe. A clue, theoretically. But to me, it felt like an accusation. Like the past had finally reached out and hooked its finger through mine, refusing to let go. Crane had vanished 20 years ago. But tonight her story had returned, and it had chosen me to hear it. I told myself it was coincidence, the storm, the open tunnel, the charm lying where no one should have been able to place it. But the lie withered quickly, collapsing under its own weight. Because the truth was simpler, quieter, and more dangerous, I had never let her case go. Even before I wore a badge, before I learned how to separate emotion from evidence and duty from desire, disappearance lived in me like a splinter beneath the skin. I had been 12 the year she vanished, old enough to absorb fear but too young to process its edges. She lived just 2 streets over. Sometimes she my cousins. Sometimes I saw her walking home from school, humming to herself. And once, a memory I had tucked so far away it felt like it belonged to someone else. She had smiled at me while tying her shoe near the park bench. "Careful out here after dark," she'd murmured, voice warm but shadowed. "Places remember what people forget." I hadn't known what she meant. I still didn't. But I remembered the way her crescent-moon necklace glinted when the streetlights flickered above us. Now that charm sat in my pocket, cold enough to sting through the fabric. Obsession is a slow thing. It begins like condensation, a thin film over the surface of your mind. You don't notice it until it thickens, until you're tracing patterns in it without realizing your fingers are moving. I spent years reading old reports, scrolling through archived articles, attending community vigils long after everyone else had stopped coming. I told myself it was empathy, curiosity, maybe a sense of duty. But standing in that tunnel, the truth seeped in like groundwater. I wasn't here because of my job. I was here because something inside me had led me back, step by step, choice by choice, until returning felt inevitable. My flashlight beam wavered across the walls, catching remnants of old handprints in the dust, smudges, shapes, maybe illusions. They looked like they were reaching outward, or inward, I couldn't tell which. "This doesn't make sense," I whispered to myself, though my voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. The charm felt heavier by the minute, as if absorbing the weight of every unsaid question. I knew what the department would say if I reported this immediately. Storm damage, coincidence, don't jump to conclusions. They'd tell me to log the artifact, submit a report, let a different unit handle the rest. But I also knew I wouldn't. Couldn't. Because somewhere between the collapsed entrance and the dust-filled chamber, the case had become more than a case again. It had become a pulse, faint, insistent, threading itself through the chambers of my heart with the slow precision of a needle. Duty pulled me forward. Obsession anchored me in place. Between them stretched a thin, fraying line, and I could already feel myself leaning toward the wrong side of it. As I turned to leave, the tunnel seemed to narrow behind me, as if urging me not to retreat too quickly. Shadows flickered like breath, or memory. And beneath everything, the silence, the dust, the cold, I felt her. Not as a ghost, not as a haunting, but as a presence carved into the corridors of my mind long before tonight. The mountain wasn't giving up secrets. It was returning, something I had been too afraid to claim. The story was waking. And so was mine. Morning crawled reluctantly across the sky when I stepped back into town, pale, diluted, as though even the sun hesitated to shine on a place stitched together by old wounds. The necklace weighed against my chest from inside my jacket. I hadn't meant to keep it, but some objects refuse to remain evidence. They become confessions, warming themselves against the heart until they feel like part of your pulse. I drove straight to Crane's house, though I'd promised myself I wouldn't. She lived in the same trim white bungalow she had insisted on maintaining all these years, pruning the shrubs, repainting the shutters, sweeping the porch, as if order might coax her daughter back, or at least hold the world still long enough for her memory to stay sharp. She opened the door before I reached it, as if she'd been waiting. Her face had aged like parchment, thin, lined, yet stubbornly intact. Grief doesn't soften people, it hardens them into something brittle. She looked at me with that brittle stillness now, her eyes reflecting not suspicion, but expectation, the familiar ache of a woman who believes in bad news more easily than good. "Something happened," she said quietly, not a question. I nodded, something surfaced. Her fingers tightened around the doorframe. I noticed the faint tremor that traveled through them like a whispered echo. This woman had outlasted 20 winters since losing her daughter, yet the smallest mention of the case still carved new lines into her expression. "Come in," she murmured, though her voice carried no warmth, only endurance. Inside, the house smelled of lavender and old paper, as though time itself had soaked into the walls. The living room remained exactly as it had been the year disappeared. Floral curtains, family photos, a shelf of ceramic birds, a memorial frozen in place. The carpet had indentations where furniture hadn't moved in decades. Sat but not fully, she hovered on the edge of the armchair, hands folded so tightly they drained the color from her knuckles. I stayed standing. "What did you find?" she asked. I hesitated, sensing the house leaning inward as if listening. "A personal item," I said carefully, "something that belonged to." The words landed between us like an unseen weight. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. "You don't have it with you," she observed after a moment, voice thin. I swallowed, no. I didn't tell her that the charm felt too much like a heartbeat when I touched it. I didn't tell her it had burned cold against my skin, as if calling something I wasn't ready to face. Instead, I watched her eyes search mine, looking for answers I couldn't give. There were other characters in this story too, not many, but enough to deepen the shadows. One was Deputy Hale, my closest colleague and the one person who knew just how often I revisited the Crane file under the guise of misfiled paperwork or routine reevaluation. Hale had a steadiness eye, a grounding presence that made people confess things without meaning to. He was loyal, but not blind. He had noticed the shift in me long before I admitted it to myself. You're slipping, he told me once months ago. You keep staring at the past like it owes you something. It doesn't. But what if it did? What if the past owed everyone the truth? The third character, or maybe the first, depending on how you count time, was Lydia Mercer's closest friend. She still lived in town, quietly, working as a night shift nurse at the small regional clinic. Lydia was the last person to see alive. She walked her halfway home, but turned back when her pager buzzed. Years later, Lydia still avoided certain streets. When I found her after leaving, she was standing outside the clinic, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Her hair was tied in a loose braid, her scrubs rumpled. You're here about her, she said, exhaustion tracing her voice. Yes. She didn't ask who her was. His ghost hovered too close behind every conversation. Something changed, I told her. Lydia exhaled sharply, as though the night air struck her lungs. I had a dream about her last week, she murmured. The kind where you wake up cold like someone opened a door. I felt that door too, the one in the mountain, the one in my mind. Tell me, I urged. But she shook her head. It wasn't a dream you talk about, it was a dream you survive. Her voice faltered. For a moment, I saw the girl she used to be, hopeful, bright, tethered to a friend who promised they'd leave this town together someday. Loss had drained the color from Lydia's life as thoroughly as it had from us. The three of them, Lydia, Hale, circled around the case like orbiting moons, each pulled by a gravity they could not escape. Each carried guilt in different shapes. But the heaviest orbit belonged to me. Because every reawakened memory, every conversation, every trembling half-truth only tightened the thread that wound between past and my present. This wasn't investigation anymore. It was inheritance. The kind you never asked for but couldn't refuse. I returned to the station late, long after the halls emptied and the night dispatcher settled behind her glass booth with a paperback novel. My office felt cold, as though someone had opened a window hours before and forgotten to close it. The case file, the one I had kept in my bottom drawer, the one I pretended not to revisit, waited with the quiet patience of something long neglected. When I opened it, a soft gust of time-worn paper drifted upward. Inside were the expected things. Photos, interviews, maps from 2002 marked with bright red circles that had since faded to rust. But there was also an item I had almost forgotten, his diary, retrieved from her bedroom during the initial search. It wasn't a diary in the traditional sense, more like an accumulation of small entries, scattered thoughts, sketches, and lists of things she wanted to remember or forget. The handwriting danced across the pages in loops that grew sharper as the entries progressed. I opened it at random. A page fluttered to life beneath my fingers. Places hold memories the way skin holds scars. Some just take longer to show. Another page. A tunnel is a promise. Something waits at the end, even if it's not what you hoped for. A third. He watches from the ridge sometimes, says the night is quieter there, says the wind speaks differently in the mountains. No name, no context, just he. My pulse tightened. The symbolic pattern stretched across these entries: darkness, tunnels, wind, the quiet gaze of an unnamed observer, weaving themselves into a narrative that felt less like writing and more like a premonition. Then there were the photographs. Dozens. Some from school events. Some from hikes. Some from the town fair the summer before she vanished. Most were mundane, but three photos I had forgotten entirely. In the first, stood near the ridge, the same ridge above the tunnel, her smile strained, her body angled slightly away from the camera, as though someone had called her name seconds before the shutter clicked. In the second, the same ridge, but this time she was alone, looking away from the camera, her crescent necklace catching the dying light. In the third, the background ridge blurred softly, unfocused. But behind, barely visible, stood a shadowed figure. Not distinct, not recognizable, yet undeniably present. Could have been a tree. Could have been a person. Could have been both. Pattern or coincidence. Symbol or clue. Memory or manipulation. The human mind connects dots even when none exist, but my mind invoked him again. The he from her diary, the watcher on the ridge, the ghost of 2002 shifting in the corner of every photograph. When I looked closer, something else emerged, a subtle alignment. The photos weren't taken days apart, as I once assumed. The lighting, her clothing, the angle of the sun, all pointed to the same day. The last day she was seen, and the last image anyone ever captured of her alive. My breath faltered. Patterns weren't forming. They were returning. Sleep had been a stranger for days, slipping through the cracks of my thoughts like a shadow that didn't want to be caught. I drifted between exhaustion and something sharper, a brittle alertness that frayed the edges of reality. The necklace burned cold against my chest at night, as if reacting to something I couldn't name. By the fourth night, I stopped pretending the dreams were simply dreams. They didn't feel like visions, they felt like memories. Not mine, but familiar, as though I had once stood close enough to someone else's fear that it left an imprint on my lungs. In one dream, I walked behind on the ridge. In another, she turned to me, eyes hollow with some unspoken warning. In a third, she whispered, "You were there." I jolted awake each time, sweat chilling my spine. I tried to dismiss them as subconscious projections, a mind overloaded with clues, interviews, and unresolved guilt. But the line between waking and dreams thinned each night, until I feared stepping through the wrong side of consciousness. That's when Hale confronted me. "Your reports are inconsistent," he said one evening, voice steady but eyes lined with concern. "You say the charm is evidence, but you haven't logged it. You say you found it in a collapse site, but there's no record of recent entry. You say you're following leads." "I am," I insisted. He frowned. "Are you?" The question wasn't aggressive, it was almost gentle. That frightened me more than anger would have. "The tunnel," I said, "the ridge, the diary entries, it all connects." Hale hesitated, then softly, "Which tunnel?" Cold washed through me. "The old service tunnel under the ridge. It opened after the storm, I told you." His expression tightened. "That tunnel was sealed with concrete years ago. No storm would open it." "I was inside it," I snapped. "Show me." We drove to the ridge. The entrance, the collapse, the shadowed mouth of the mountain. Gone. Only smooth, unbroken concrete remained. Not new, not recently patched. Old, weathered, untouched for decades. My breath clawed at my chest. This isn't right, it was open, I was inside. Hale's silence deepened, and something in that silence broke me. Because if the tunnel hadn't been open, if no one else had seen it, if the mountain had remained sealed all these years, then where had I found the necklace? And what had I been walking through? My memories flickered, reassembling themselves too quickly, too fluidly, like someone rearranging photographs in real time. I know what I saw, I whispered. But even to me, the words trembled. Hale placed a careful hand on my shoulder. You need rest. I jerked away, heart hammering. Don't condescend to me. But behind the anger lurked something sharper. Doubt. Not of the evidence. Not of the case. Of myself. Because in that moment the ridge seemed unreal, too still, too silent, its shadows too perfectly placed. The wind carried a faint whisper, almost like a sigh of disappointment. As though the mountain itself knew, I had stepped too far inside a memory that wasn't mine. Or worse, one that was. Lydia's dream. Us waiting. Us diary. The photos. The tunnel. The shadow. They swirled around me like a storm of half-truths. And somewhere within it, a whisper pressed against my mind. You were there. You were always there. But how? Why? What did that mean? The truth twisted, writhing into a shape that resembled guilt. Not facts. Not evidence. But guilt. The kind that grows in silence until it becomes a voice. 2 weeks later, the case was officially closed. A suspect confessed. A man who had lived near thee in 2002. A man who matched the shadow in the photos. A man whose name appeared silently between the lines of his diary. The department celebrated, cried with a grief softened by hollow relief. Lydia left town for good. And I stood in the interrogation hallway while the mountain wind howled beyond the windows, its voice scraping like something ancient and dissatisfied. But none of it felt real. The suspect's confession was too neat, too rehearsed, the shape of guilt without the weight of truth. Hale insisted it was closure, that I needed to let go. Let go. As if obsession were a string you could simply release. As if the mind didn't hold on, even when the heart begged for silence. I returned to the ridge one last time. The wind greeted me with a cold whisper. The concrete wall, the one Hale swore had never cracked, stretched blank and indifferent beside me. But when I placed my hand on it, the surface felt warm. Breathing. A faint tremor pulsed beneath my palm, like a heartbeat buried too deep to recognize. A memory stirred. Not mine. Not entirely. His voice melted through the wind, faint, fragile. Places remember what people forget. The necklace around my neck grew heavier, its chain tightening as though it recognized where we stood. The truth had been uncovered. But the truth felt wrong. Incomplete. Distorted. I remembered the dreams. The footsteps behind. My own shadow stretching across the ridge. And for a moment, a brief, paralyzing moment, I felt a memory surge through me. Her turning. Her eyes widening. Her whisper. You shouldn't be here. My breath hitched. Not in fear.